JAN has been in service for over 30 years. They were founded in 1983 on the campus of West Virginia University. And the Job Accommodation Network actually predates the ADA. JAN is one of several services provided by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. Its development has been achieved through collaborative efforts of ODEP, West Virginia University, and private industry throughout North America. We offer consultation on workplace accommodations, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act, and entrepreneurship. Now, our entrepreneurship team provides self-employment and small business development expertise and gives referrals regarding business planning, financing strategies, marketing research, disability-specific programs, income supports and benefits planning, e-commerce, independent contracting, home-based business operations, and small business initiatives for disabled veterans. Customers who use this service receive a resource packet tailored to their specific goals, with consultants available throughout all stages of the process who can provide ongoing support. JAN consultants are experienced in the field and have all earned at least one master's degree in their specialized field, ranging from rehabilitation counseling to education and engineering. And we're split into specialty teams, which include sensory, motor, and cognitive or neurological. And this allows us to give more detailed and specific information based on the disability type. Our services are all free, and we are a national service, so we can talk with anyone from across the country. And we find that our service is easy to use. JAN offers several ways to obtain information. That confidential, personalized assistance can be obtained through phone. From 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, customers can call JAN toll-free to speak with a consultant. You can also reach us on our website, which is askjan.org. There we offer more than 300 disability-specific publications, as well as our searchable online accommodation resource, or SOAR, which enables users to explore accommodation options for different disabilities and workplace settings. This can be a great resource to get general ideas and find resources on common ADA issues. We also have a JAN on-demand service, which provides customers with individualized email responses to questions about accommodations in the ADA. We can also be reached via social media. JAN connects with users through a variety of social media platforms, from Facebook and LinkedIn to Twitter, blogs, and Second Life. Through in-person trainings, we can also deliver workshops at events sponsored by corporations, organizations, and federal, state, and local governments. And all of our services are confidential. Ask JAN and we meet you where you are. We can help you to meet timelines, assist with the interactive process, give targeted technical assistance based on your specific needs, provide comprehensive resources, and maintain confidentiality. We also have an ongoing research study at JAN. Some employers may have concerns about the cost of providing reasonable accommodation, but according to the results of our research efforts, the benefits often outweigh the costs. If someone chooses to participate in our research, approximately 8 weeks after their initial contact, the employers are asked a series of questions about the situation they discussed with JAN and the quality of services JAN provided. The study results consistently show that benefits employers receive from making workplace accommodations far outweigh the costs associated. Employers often report that providing accommodations results in benefits such as retention of valuable employees, improving productivity and morale, a reduction in workers' compensation and training costs, and improved company diversity. These benefits were obtained with little investment, with many employers reporting that accommodations cost nothing at all to make, or typically cost only about $500. Now, of course, if you are familiar with AT, you know that that can vary depending on the type of needs that the person has, but oftentimes accommodations might not be as pricey as the employer may expect. And we do have some situations and solutions to share with you that are pulled from this research. Now, to go over our objectives, we wanted to provide a bit of information about JAN, as well as give information about reasonable accommodations and the interactive process. We wanted to provide some information on the definition of reasonable and what's considered a reasonable accommodation. We also want to provide information on 6 general steps to follow in the interactive process. And we have some accommodation examples from our research study, as well as resources that may be helpful. And we'd also like to take time for your questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Teresa for some additional information on requesting accommodations.
Thanks, Brittany. So we included this slide in today's presentation because people are always asking JAN consultants, what is a reasonable accommodation? Is this reasonable? Is that reasonable? We have here a definition from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is actually from the Title I Technical Assistance Manual, which you can find a copy of on our website. And according to the EEOC's guidance, a reasonable accommodation could be any change in the work environment or in the way things are done in the work environment that results in an equal employment opportunity for an individual with a disability. A lot of the examples that we're going to be discussing today involve acquiring or modifying equipment or devices, but there are a number of other things that could be accommodations, like job restructuring, where maybe part of the job is reassigned to someone else. A small part, a marginal function, changing a work schedule, even being reassigned to a different position. A very common one is modifying a policy or modifying a work schedule. So there are a lot of things that can be reasonable accommodations. There's actually another EEOC document called Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship under the ADA, which you can also find linked on the JAN website, that goes into more detail on what the EEOC says about this term reasonable. So one of the things they say is that reasonable means reasonable on its face, i.e. ordinarily or in the run of cases, which is why you'll sometimes hear people saying reasonable means reasonable. The next thing we'd like to go into today is the interactive process. That is a process that is recommended but not technically required per guidance from the EEOC. And we wanted to talk with you about it today because employers use what we call the interactive process, and many of them use the 6-step JAN interactive process when they're providing accommodations. So we think it's good for AT professionals and other service providers to be aware of that process. So why would it be a good idea for an employer to have a process? Well, one important benefit is consistency. A process supports the selection and implementation of successful accommodations. And if you have a process on which your staff are consistently trained, well, that could potentially be helpful as part of an overall attempt to show that an employer is making a good faith effort to accommodate. It can be helpful to be aware of the various types of professionals that might be assisting the employee in their efforts to get a reasonable accommodation. We have a not-included list on this slide. Many different types of therapists, assistive tech professionals, rehab counselors. So many people don't realize that the EEOC allows employers to require that medical documentation supporting an accommodation request come from an appropriate medical professional, but that professional doesn't have to be an MD per the guidance. Okay, so let's go into a little more detail on the interactive process. Here on this slide, we have the 6 steps in JAN's interactive process. So while the interactive process is a concept that comes from EEOC guidance, JAN has kind of put this in plain English by putting a 6-step process together for people to use as a model. So we're going to go through these one by one, but making an accommodation request or correctly receiving an accommodation request, recognizing that one has taken place, is step 1. In step 2, the employee and their medical providers who are assisting them provide information, and the employer is gathering that information together. In step 3, accommodation options are explored. In step 4, an accommodation is chosen. Step 5 will be implementing the accommodation, and in step 6, we monitor. So again, step 1 is making an accommodation request, and for an employer, rather than making the accommodation request, they might be correctly recognizing that a request has been made. So if you're assisting someone who is making a request, here are some tips. You want to make sure that the person you're assisting is aware of their rights under the ADA. It's a good idea for the person making the request to document it. While it's okay to make a request verbally, you probably want to have some idea of when you made it and what you said. And that's why the Job Accommodation Network has guidance on how to write an accommodation request letter and the types of things that would go into that. Because while it's not required that a request be made in writing, it's just a good idea to have a record. Employees should be prepared to be very clear and specific about what their needs are and what problem they're encountering in the workplace. So those are just some tips. Now remember, if the first attempt at making an accommodation request doesn't work out, maybe because the person didn't provide enough information, it's usually possible to go back and fill in those gaps later. Let's look at an example. An employee has been out of work for 6 months with a workers' compensation injury. The employee's doctor sends the employer a letter stating that the employee is released to work, but with certain work restrictions. Is this an accommodation request? I'm going to say yes, because it's been made known to the employer that workplace accommodation, some type of change in the way things are done, is needed, and it's because of a medical condition. According to the EEOC, the bare minimum required to make an accommodation request is that the employer is made aware that something either in the work environment itself or in the way things are usually done at work needs to be changed for a medical reason. Now let's look at step 2, providing information. So when someone is assisting an individual seeking an accommodation by, say, providing some medical documentation or perhaps answering some questions from the employer, we encourage describing the limitation in the problem in sufficient detail that the employer can understand how the person meets the definition of disability under ADA and what problem they're experiencing in the workplace, enough that connects the dots between the person's condition and why they need this or that particular accommodation. For employers, we encourage them to get information from the individual when possible, because the person who is seeking an accommodation might have a lot of good insight into what they need and what has worked and not worked for them in the past. At this stage, it's a good idea to use ADA language like disability, limitation, and accommodation. The EEOC does say that, particularly for an initial request, an employee doesn't have to use words like that. They can use what's called plain English. But using the proper terms can help just enhance the clarity of a conversation with an employer and help them to understand what's needed. We do have some publications on the JAN website that we hope will assist you with understanding this part of the process. One of them is called Medical Inquiry in Response to an Accommodation Request. And this gives the basics on what's allowed and not allowed in terms of medical questions from an employer to an employee. There's also some information about how an employer could put together a sample form requesting medical documentation. And here at JAN, when we keep getting asked the same thing over and over again, eventually we get smart and write a document about it. This one was written for doctors. It's called Practical Guidance for Medical Professionals, Helping Patients Write Effective Accommodation Request Letters. The nice thing about it is it's really targeted to a physician or another medical professional who's trying to understand their role in the process, and it does include a sample letter at the end of the document. Let's look at another example. In response to a poor performance evaluation, a teacher provided a doctor's note claiming her multiple sclerosis is contributing to her performance problem, and says she may benefit from an accommodation. Is that all the information that an employer needs? I'm going to say probably no, because we don't really know what the limitation is that the person is experiencing, and we don't really understand the type of problems that she's encountered in the workplace. And here are some tips for step 3, exploring accommodation options. Keep an open mind when exploring accommodation options. The first suggestion to be made might not be the one that the employer winds up going with. We encourage everyone involved to respect that the individual with a disability is the expert on themselves and on their own needs, and to invite that person to suggest accommodation ideas. We also suggest consulting with other service providers as needed, and of course you can call Jan. So let's look at another example. A social worker with carpal tunnel syndrome requested a work-related aide to do all of her keyboarding for case notes. Now that might not be a really realistic expectation. A lot of people do make this request, but it's not one that we see granted a lot, not anymore, because assistive technology has advanced. So how can we figure out what else might work? One option, of course, would be to contact Jan or to seek out some resources on our website. We do have a lot of information on accommodations for various limitations, such as use of the hand, fine motor, person with one hand, etc. An ergonomic assessment might help in this particular case. And some of the typical accommodations that come to mind would be speech recognition software, which we all know used to be terrible, but now it's really much, much better. I use it myself. And providing an alternative keyboard and mouse. And it doesn't have to be either or. There are certainly plenty of people who use both speech recognition and alternate input devices of other types as well. Well, what if it's after 6 Eastern Time and Jan is closed? Well, our website is open all the time, and we do have a section called the Searchable Online Accommodation Resource, which will take you through a series of sort of guided steps, where you start by selecting the impairment, the diagnosis perhaps, and then the limitation the person is experiencing on account of that impairment. And you can go sort of dialing down from page to page until you come to a solution. So you can select the job function. You might select keyboarding if you were using this example. And then you'll come to a vendor list, some information on accommodation ideas, and some links to sample products. So that's askjan.org/SOAR if you want to go there. In step 4, we choose an accommodation. According to guidance from the EEOC, employers do have the right to choose among the range of effective accommodations. So if there is more than one accommodation approach that would be effective, the employer can choose an effective accommodation that is easier for them to provide instead of the employee's first choice. Many employers are not aware of this, so it may help for employers to explain their decision-making process as they're going through it, and to explain why a particular accommodation is being chosen. Now, of course, if the accommodation turns out not to be effective, the employee needs to let the employer know that it's not working. So if you're acting as an employer or assisting one, you may want to pay careful attention to what the employee is telling you, and also to any medical documentation that they provide, since this will likely give you information about the potential effectiveness of various accommodation options. It's okay to explore potential options and their effectiveness, but you want to avoid selecting something that clearly will not work. And you might wind up coming back to the drawing table if things don't turn out as planned. But let's not plan to fail. Also, talking to the employee about their preferences and taking those ideas into account can be helpful in choosing an accommodation that is effective. And it helps keep the employee engaged in the process. Let's look at another example. A customer service representative with diabetes had a strong body odor that he could not reduce until he got his diabetes under control. His employer was considering something a bit unorthodox, putting up cubicle walls and an air purifier in his work area. The job could be done from home, but the employer was concerned about isolating the employee. Now, why they thought it would be less isolating to work from home than to work in a box, I've never been particularly clear on. But That's why this process exists. So in this particular case, the employee really preferred to work at home. So the employer's concern that they might feel isolated wasn't really a big issue for the employee. In this example, the employee was more concerned about the cubicle and the air purifiers drawing a lot of attention. Because of good communication between the employee and the employer, the employee was able to express their preferences and concerns, and the employer then had the opportunity to take those preferences and concerns into account when making a decision. So talk to the employee. In step 5, the accommodation is implemented. Let's talk a bit about step 5. It's important to keep the lines of communication open during this process, particularly if there's equipment involved. It's important for the employee to know who they can go to for help if something isn't working. They just need to know who to contact. Keeping the communication flowing can help to keep the individual engaged so that the employer knows about problems and can address them right away. Now, we do often hear from AT professionals that the individual will contact them directly when there's a problem. But we think it can be beneficial for the employee to have somebody internal to the employer to seek out first. Let's look at another example. A secretary with a voice disorder had difficulty speaking for long periods of time. Her employer purchased her a text-to-speech communication device with phone connectivity. So how might a service provider help with that implementation? Well, equipment like this, particularly when you're dealing with an employer's phone system, it's likely going to need customized, or the settings might need to be set up in a way that meets the individual's needs and that works with their preferences. Employees might need training on how to use their assistive technology as well. And somebody from the IT department may need to be informed or trained on how to do some basic troubleshooting. Sometimes an employer might need to go outside of the organization for troubleshooting, of course, especially when equipment is involved. But if there's an option to have someone trained internally to deal with those day-to-day problems that may come up, I think that's useful. It's very important that the employee knows who they can go to in case there's a problem or a change in their needs. In larger organizations, it might help to give the employee a point person with whom they can communicate about any issues they're experiencing with their accommodation. Now, depending on the situation, that might be somebody in HR. It could be somebody with more day-to-day interaction with the employee, like a supervisor. Many times an IT professional might take on part of that role. It's good if the IT professional knows that that's coming, so that it doesn't catch them by surprise. I think it makes sense to clarify with the vendor what type of ongoing support, if any, they'd be able to provide, and whether there would be an additional cost for that ongoing support. And if the recommendations were part of an on-site assessment, or they came from a doctor, then the employer might want to plan ahead for how and under what circumstances they might be contacted if needed again. Again, confidentiality is key. In step 6, we monitor the accommodation, make sure that it's still effective, that the person knows who to contact if there's a problem, so that we can encourage all of that ongoing communication. Let's look at an example. An auditor with progressive vision loss from macular degeneration started using screen reading software a year ago. Recently, the employer purchased a new database, only to find out that the employee's screen reading software doesn't work with the new database. Would the employer have avoided this problem? Probably. Whenever an employer is purchasing new equipment, whether it's assistive tech or something that a person would need to access using assistive tech, there could be accessibility issues that need to be addressed. And employees need to be prepared to communicate about the problems that they're encountering with their assistive tech and what types of modifications might be needed. For more information, you can see our publication, The Interactive Process, and service providers, which you can find on the JAN website. And now Brittany is going to start us off with some accommodation examples from the JAN study. Take it away, Brittany.
Thank you, Teresa. For our first example from this study, there was a healthcare worker with low vision who was having difficulty using her computer. At first, the employer tried upgrading the employee's operating system, but when that wasn't effective, the employer purchased screen magnification software. And this is something that we often talk about with consumers. If you're having difficulty accessing the computer, check out the built-in accessibility features that you already have on your device. If updates might be helpful, that's something to consider. Now, if the built-in features aren't going to be sufficient, you might want to then consider, is there a piece of equipment or software that we could purchase that might address this limitation? And when it comes to computer access for someone with a vision impairment, you're often going to be looking at things like screen magnification, screen readers, or using a screen reader in conjunction with a braille display. The results that we got from the study indicated that the cost of providing the accommodation was $325. Now, if you're familiar with Zoom text, you'll probably know that the cost was a bit higher now, so this is a bit older of an example. But the employer reported the benefit that the company was able to retain a highly valued and skilled employee, and this sent a message to her department that they care, even though they were a large company. For our next example, a nurse with a hearing impairment worked the night shift and had to talk to doctors who called for information. She was having difficulty hearing over the telephone. The employee asked to be moved to a day shift where there would be other nurses who could talk to the doctors, but there were no day shift openings available at that time. The employer purchased a telephone amplifier which enabled the nurse to hear effectively over the telephone. The employer reported a cost of $50 for the accommodation and reported that the benefit was it helped the individual serve patients better. Next, we have an older example from the Jan study. I like it because it talks about a time when equipment was used instead of something else that perhaps the employee had planned. A customer service representative with a circulatory condition needed to move her legs periodically. But the job required employees to stay at their desks unless they were on scheduled breaks. Their productivity was measured by the number of calls completed. So there was a potential productivity issue, perhaps some type of policy or conduct rule about staying at the desk. Could this have been solved with a modified break schedule? Possibly. Or a wireless headset? Possibly. But we went a different way in this particular case, or I should say the employer did. The employer wound up purchasing an under-the-desk exercise pedal device that enabled the employee to exercise her legs while on the phone. Of course, there's a lot of different ways you could handle this. The treadmill desks are exciting, but they can be very expensive. This only cost $40 and enabled the employee to meet production standards and take care of her health at the same time. Let's look at another one. A preschool educator with cerebral palsy had left side weakness and difficulty walking. His human resources person raised concerns about using the cane at work and considered reassigning him. For whatever reason, people do get worked up about canes and safety. And in a way I can understand, but the cane is usually meant as a device to help keep the person safe. The employee didn't like the reassignment idea very much, not surprisingly. The employee said they could do their job. They were able to do the job without any accommodation except use of the cane. After he brought in medical documentation, he was permitted to use the cane at work. So many times an accommodation related to a piece of equipment involves modifying a policy perhaps to allow the use of that. Or maybe there's not even a formal policy in place, but the accommodation is allowing the employee to use those things that they need to use that they use in everyday life also in the workplace as well. Same thing goes, by the way, for service animals. Accommodation involving a service animal is almost always essentially a modification of a no-animal policy. We did not get cost-benefit data for this particular case, but I don't think it really cost him anything to let the guy bring his cane to work. Now for our next example, A customer service representative at a credit card company had Parkinson's, which resulted in seizure activity, back pain, and difficulty using a computer with a standard monitor. A monitor for vision problems and a chair for his back problems were purchased. And this might be a situation where it might be helpful to consider an ergonomic assessment. The employer reported a one-time cost of $525. The accommodations provided did alleviate the employee's conditions slightly, but the employee still reported concerns about being terminated if another blackout incident occurred while he was working with a customer. And I think this is a good example of a situation where the employer may provide some accommodations that help to address some limitations, but we might still need to revisit the issue to determine if there's anything more that can be provided. In our next example, a pediatrician with ADHD was having difficulty meeting the performance standards at work. She was struggling to meet the patient quota per day and often had to stay late to finish her duties. This was starting to cause issues with coworkers picking up extra patients and the employer having to pay overtime. They tried a few accommodations, but were struggling to find something effective. The employer called Jan looking for some ideas. After speaking with a Jan consultant, the employer provided a watchminder vibrating watch as an accommodation. The watch was set to alert the employee every 5 minutes through a vibration. This helped the employee pace herself throughout the day and break down what she needed to accomplish during each 5-minute interval of the appointment. There was a reported cost of $100 for this accommodation, but it was said to help the employee improve her performance.
Yeah, Brittany, what I like so much about this example is it's a creative use of the watchminder. So often we receive criticism from people who say that it's difficult to program, but it sounds like they programmed this to perform the same way every day, so that maybe wasn't an issue.
Yeah, that's definitely something to consider when determining what piece of equipment or technology might be helpful. How is this particular device going to work with the person's day-to-day schedule? Is it conducive to their needs? That's always something that you want to be sure and take into consideration when choosing among several products that might have somewhat similar features. Now, what should an employee do if they need to file a complaint? Here at Jan, we don't handle anything to do with the complaint process. Rather, that would be the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. They're the federal agency that enforces Title I of the ADA. The EEOC offers technical assistance on the ADA provisions applying to employment, and they also provide information on how to file complaints. The EEOC can be reached online at http://www.eeoc.gov, and their telephone number is 800-669-4000. Some states have laws that go beyond the ADA requirements. If a person or employer is not otherwise covered, the employer may still have obligations under a state law. This can be important in situations where the employer may not have more than 15 employees, and in that case they probably wouldn't fall under the ADA, but there may still be state or local laws that have similar requirements. In that case, you could consider contacting your state's enforcement agency. And to do so, you can visit https://www.dfeh.ca.gov/people-with-disabilities/. Are there any other places to contact for help? These are a few resources that we frequently refer individuals or representatives to: protection and advocacy agencies, independent living centers, state vocational rehabilitation agencies, as well as the State Assistive Technology Project. And this is going to depend on the person's particular needs. If someone is looking for legal assistance or advocacy, it will often be a referral to the Protection and Advocacy Agency. For people who have questions about things like transportation or housing concerns, that might go to the independent living centers. And we often refer to the state vocational rehabilitation agencies for individuals who are job seeking, or if someone might need assistance with acquiring technology. Sometimes VR can assist with that as well. And of course, the State Assistive Technology projects are a great resource if someone is looking to explore what types of equipment might be available to them, and if they want to maybe try a demo of a product or even have something that they can borrow and use in the workplace to determine its effectiveness.
Of course, we have many other resources on our website, askjan.org. One resource that we on the sensory team get asked about all the time is hearing aid funding sources, and you can find information about that on our website. We literally have hundreds and hundreds of pages for you to explore as you're trying to figure out ways to meet your client's needs.
And as a reminder, Jan consultants can be reached Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We can be contacted by phone at 1-800-526-7234 for voice calls and 877-781-9403 for TTY. We can be emailed at jan@askjan.org. We can also be reached through Skype at Jan Consultants, and you can send us text at 304-216-8189. We also have a chat resource available on our website, which again is askjan.org. And now we wanted to take some time for any questions that you might have.
I see a question about the PowerPoint and whether the PowerPoint for this presentation is available. If you'll send an email to jan@askjan.org within the next day or two, we can certainly provide you with a download link. While we're waiting for questions to come in, Brittany and I can talk a little bit about some of the examples and process of how those things were selected. Now, in the example using the pedaling device, the feedback that we get from our callers is that you want something where the base is nice and solid, perhaps a little bit heavier than the one pictured, because otherwise these will tend to tip over. And you also may need to do other accommodations like desk, so that the person's knees don't bump against the desk. And I see a question here. Do you have a database of AT items that will be funded by state and federal agencies? We do have a database, but it's not differentiated in terms of the types of funding sources that can be used. So in other words, we have various solutions in our database like low vision enhancement options, video magnifiers, and when you go to those solutions in our database, you can see vendors that we're aware of for that type of product, but you would need to check with the people in charge of your funding stream to see whether or not you can purchase from a particular vendor. I'm seeing a comment here. It appears that the majority of the differences that were mentioned were physical. What about mental and emotional or learning differences? Well, we certainly do get a lot of calls about that. I would say oftentimes when someone is having a mental or emotional challenge in the workplace, that can be handled with AT or through a lot of other types of accommodations like modified schedules and job restructuring. One of the equipment examples that I recall from the study was a young man with an intellectual disability who had a lot of difficulty getting back on task if he was interrupted. So in other words, let's say he was halfway through a task, he worked in a grocery store, and his supervisor came up to give him a little bit of instruction or some information. He would have a lot of difficulty remembering what he was doing at the time he was interrupted. And because he couldn't remember it, he couldn't get back to it. So he was having a lot of difficulty staying on task and completing tasks. So the accommodation that was provided was actually pretty simple. It was just a little digital voice recorder so that when his supervisor was approaching him, he could take a brief moment just to record what he was doing at the time of the interruption and then listen to it at the end. And Brittany, I know you've got a lot of experience on the cognitive team. Do you have something you'd like to share?
Absolutely. To add on to what Teresa said, oftentimes the calls that we get that are related to more mental health issues are those accommodations that might not have any associated cost, like a modified schedule, flexible break time, the ability to call a support person, the ability to have the presence of a service animal in the workplace. One area where we do see assistive tech coming into play would be sort of with the rise of apps that we're seeing to help individuals monitor and manage mental health symptoms. So it, in those cases, might be giving the individual a break during which they can utilize an app on their phone or another device to help them sort of monitor those symptoms that they might be experiencing.
Yeah, one issue that we're seeing, particularly in state and federal settings, is employers wanting to limit the use of, say, Bluetooth-enabled devices in the workplace. And that can be a real challenge for people with Bluetooth-enabled hearing aids, for people who use continuous glucose monitoring systems. Those almost always use Bluetooth to connect to a phone or another type of display. For diabetes, we even have Bluetooth-enabled socks now. So it used to be outlawing Bluetooth basically meant you couldn't bring your wireless headset or maybe your phone into the work environment. But now it can really put a damper on people bringing in personal use items that they do need in order to manage their medical condition. I'd say it's a growing issue. There aren't that many places limiting it, but certainly in the government sector, we do hear about that. What do you think, Brittany?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It seems that in cases where confidentiality is a big concern, you might run into a bit more resistance from the employer regarding what kinds of devices can be brought in and can be accessed. And of course, it's worth checking in and asking if a modification to that policy would be appropriate. In some cases, it might be something the employer can do. In others, there might be a need to explore other solutions.
Yeah, so as an example, in some of the facilities where Bluetooth isn't allowed in certain parts of the facility, we're sometimes seeing employers reassign people to another job in another area of the facility, or perhaps offering a type of flexi place where they might do some of their job in a different part of the building at the times that they need to have those devices with them. So there are different ways of handling it. But we're going to see more of this, I feel, with more and more wearable devices that people are using to manage their conditions. So, you know, one of my favorite types of calls that we get is when people say, hey, we know we need, say, a video magnifier, but we need one that A, doesn't connect to the internet in any way, cannot be connected, and oh, this special feature that all video magnifiers have now, it can't have that. So just as an example, we got a call one time, someone seeking a video magnifier that could be used in a classified environment, and at that time, screen capture was just starting to become a feature of video magnifiers, you know, where you can capture an image of what you're seeing, and then you can hold the video magnifier in a different way, manipulate the image to make it easier to see or larger. They didn't want that. So we had to search high and low for a video magnifier that would give them the level of magnification that was needed, but couldn't store an image even for a short period of time. We really enjoy those types of calls, so call us with your puzzles. Yeah, that was before your time, Brittany, but I want to say it was an Amigo device.
Yeah, it's always interesting when we get those cases, like you mentioned, where it's a very common feature and we have to sort of do some digging to find something that might be appropriate for that setting, but it is fun.
Well, I think one of the most exciting things going on in AT today is all of the new wearable devices for low vision. We're seeing so many, and now there's one that will actually interface with the occipital cortex. I believe you saw that one at CSUN, didn't you, Brittany?
Yeah, so one of our favorite things as consultants is having the opportunity to go to technology conferences and see the different devices that are in development or that are recently released. And one of the things we saw at the CSUN conference recently was the Argus 2 retinal prosthesis system. This was something that was really interesting as it's giving the ability to perceive some light patterns for individuals who have lost their sight due to retinitis pigmentosa. And the company who is providing this actually has one in development that can be used for any type of vision loss.
Any vision loss where the person had vision at one time, right? It'll be interesting to see how that technology develops. I remember when cochlear implants were first out, it basically gave the ability to perceive sound when a person had lost that ability. But at first, it was very difficult for people to differentiate sound, and it was a long time before we heard a lot of success stories about people returning to, say, using speech, using their cochlear implants, but now they're quite good. I'm really interested in how that technology is going to develop. But there are a lot of basically wearable video magnifiers now, and it's interesting to see the types of features that the various manufacturers are choosing to add or choosing to leave out. And of course there's the OrCam, which will do OCR, but it doesn't magnify. And you like that one, don't you, Brittany, because it's got a little bit of a lower profile to it.
Yeah, a lot of the wearable vision devices that we're seeing may be sort of bulky, and they're things that you're oftentimes going to be wearing like a traditional pair of glasses, and sometimes that might not be something that you want taking up a lot of space on your face. Whereas the OrCam MyEye device is something that is a little more discreet. It's a smaller device designed to connect to the side of the wearer's glasses, and then the individual can make hand gestures to activate the device's features. It can do things like face recognition, it can recognize products, it can read information out loud. It can really do a lot of interesting things, but like you said, it doesn't have that magnification that you might see with some other wearables.
Yeah, and the ones that magnify, what's been really interesting to me is the types of professionals that are most interested in this so far, who've been calling in, have been teachers, wanting to use them for classroom management. Oh, I see a question. Do you have any favorite apps that you are recommending in the workplace? Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. There's so many apps out there. And at JAN we don't usually use the word recommend, but there are a few that I do love to talk about. The AVA app is one that's newer in the past year or two for supporting face-to-face communication between someone who is deaf or hard of hearing and someone who is not. And we are hearing from a few people who've used it kind of as a stopgap measure for captioning when a card captioner was not available or wasn't available in the time frame needed. But what it does is it's designed to run on, say, 2 phones. So I have a phone and Brittany has a phone, and I can speak, and the microphone on my phone will pick up my voice, and my voice will go across the internet to Ava, and then the words appear on the screen of Brittany's phone. And then if Brittany wants, she can speak, or she could use her on-screen keyboard to type back, and a computer-generated voice will come out of the phone on my side. Yeah, AVA, that's correct. So that's just one example.
An app that I've found really interesting lately is called Seeing AI, and this is an app designed for users with low to no vision. This is going to provide that text-to-speech feature that we're seeing a lot more these days. This one is interesting because it does something that, as far as we know, no other OCR devices are doing, and that's the ability to recognize and read handwriting. So oftentimes with these kinds of systems, it's going to require the information that's being read to be printed. Now, Seeing AI recently released a new feature that is handwriting recognition, and it's going to read out that information in the same way that it would with printed text. Now, of course it can be a little more challenging. Let's say you have someone with messy handwriting like I do. It might have a little more trouble deciphering that, but if you have some handwriting that's pretty neat, this works pretty well. And it's in its early stages as far as this feature goes, so I'm really interested to see how that improves.
Yeah, where else it's really helpful is when someone is trying to read something that it's an unusual font or a decorative type font. We've seen Seeing AI do pretty well with those types of very elaborate decorative fonts. And we did try it with handwriting here at the Job Accommodation Network. We love trying out apps. Didn't read my handwriting that well, but I have cubital tunnel syndrome. Brittany, it actually did pretty well with your handwriting.
Yeah, I've actually tried it a few times and had some success if I'm trying my best to write neatly. So this is something that if it were to improve and be able to recognize and sort of decipher handwriting that might be a little messier, it could potentially be something that would be helpful in a setting like a classroom for teachers who might have to grade papers with students' handwriting, things like that. Of course, we're not quite there yet, but if it can improve to that point, that would certainly be a really helpful feature.
Now, you're more familiar with the Seeing AI than I am. Is that spelled Seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G, space, capital A, capital I? That's what I'm remembering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there is another app with a similar name that wants you to like create an account and have a subscription, and those apps are very different. The Seeing AI, that's from Microsoft, isn't it?
Yes, and that is a free app, and as far as I'm aware, when I've used it, you aren't asked to sign up for anything or give any kind of personal information.
Yeah, but the feedback that I saw on the iDevices mailing list said some people are downloading an app with a similar name that's wanting them to subscribe, and this app is not that app. Another app that I like for communication is FlipWriter AAC. That's FlipWriter AAC. So this started out as a pretty simple app where basically there's an on-screen keyboard and a little screen. You typed what you wanted to say, and then you flipped the thing around so that the other person could type. But with the newer versions, they're a little bit more expensive, but they include a lot of great features like text-to-speech and speech-to-text, as long as you have access to the Internet. FlipWriter AAC is another one that goes out in emails all the time from Jen. We don't recommend or endorse particular apps or vendors, but we sure love our product database. Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, it's certainly a pleasure being here with you today. Brittany and I love the chance to talk about assistive technology and how it can be used in the workplace. And we really thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today.